So I'll just introduce myself briefly. My name is Derek McKee. Je suis professeur de droit à l'Université de Montréal et je suis président de l'Association canadienne des professeurs de droit. I hope that all of you are doing well, or as well as possible under the current circumstances. I also want to take a moment to say that although this meeting is taking place in a virtual space, I think that we need to take a moment to reflect on the physical spaces where all of us are located. Most of us are in Canada, where we are on the traditional territory of many different Indigenous peoples. And I just want to say on behalf of CALT, on behalf of the Canadian Association of Law Teachers, that we acknowledge the traditional caretakers of our lands, and we're grateful for the opportunity to share the land, and that through our work we want to strive to overcome the legacy of colonialism and white supremacy that has affected the settlement of this land. This event is dedicated to law teaching and learning in the context of COVID, and as many of you are aware, it comes out of the cancellation of CALT's 2020 conference, which was supposed to have occurred as part of the Congress of the Social Sciences and Humanities at Western University. The theme for Congress this year was meant to have been Bridging Divides, Confronting Colonialism and Anti-Black Racism. Obviously, that's a theme. The last few days have shown that the theme of confronting anti-Black racism is as relevant as ever. And so we'd like to keep that in mind as we organize this event and future events. We'll see whether it's possible to bring it back in an in-person conference at some point, maybe next year or at another point. Before we get started with the panel today, I also just want to quickly mention a couple of other upcoming CALT events. CALT's annual general meeting will take place tomorrow by Zoom, starting at the same time. So for those of you who are interested in CALT, that's an opportunity to find out what's going on with the organization and possibly get more involved. So that's at 1 p.m. tomorrow Eastern Time, and I'll send around the link for the Zoom meeting for that later this afternoon. Je voulais aussi mentionner qu'il y aura un panel en français sur les mêmes thèmes que le panel d'aujourd'hui, qui aura lieu le 17 juin. Alors, l'information pour le panel français se trouve sur notre site web. You can find information about the French panel on the website. So we would love to have many of you participate in that. So I will just make sure that everyone in the waiting room is in. We're up to 107 participants now, which is fantastic. We conceived of this online panel event to be something like a round table event at a conference. When you go to a conference and there are panelists who will offer their personal impressions, a more informal setting than what you might get with formal presentations of research. We're going to do a few rounds of commentary and invite the panelists to speak first. And in order to streamline things for the purposes of Zoom call, each of the panelists has been invited to introduce themselves instead of doing formal introductions. And then after the panelists have had a chance to talk a bit, we will have a question and answer period. I wanted to mention that unfortunately, Eric Adams of the University of Alberta, who was meant to join us for the panel today, had to send his regrets due to a family emergency. So our thoughts are with Eric and his family, and unfortunately he won't be able to call in today, but I know he would have very much liked to participate on the panel. Just a procedural note for the question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question or participate in the question and answer session, please use the chat function and send your question to David Wiseman, who is co-hosting the meeting with me. David will take the questions that are asked and prompt people when it's their turn to ask a question. So if you don't mind doing that, that will be the best way. You don't have to send your question to everyone, just use the chat function and direct it particularly to David Wiseman, and he will be able to direct to cue you when it's time to ask your question. So we asked the panelists, so without further ado, I'll get on to inviting the panelists to speak. And I will invite BC Akinkugbe to speak first. We're going to basically go in alphabetical order by the panelists right away. And we're basically just asked the panelists, first of all, to situate themselves in relation to the pandemic circumstances, to talk about their role within their institution and what they have had to be engaged with over the last few months as they dealt with the impact of the pandemic, and just to briefly give a few introductory remarks about their initial reflections, and then we'll go around again. So BC, would you like to take it from there?
Sure. So thank you, Derek, and to the CULT Executive Committee for the invitation to be part of this conversation. I'm an assistant professor at the Schulich School of Law, Dalhousie University. And in that capacity, I have taught contracts and international trade law and international human rights law. But particularly as it relates to teaching, I have been chair of the Teaching and Evaluation Committee at Dalhousie University Schulich School of Law, and also part of the working group that is currently discussing the plans to really move on to teaching and in online in the fall. So that's as far as it's gone in terms of involvement. But in the past week, I also had the privilege, I should say, to teach pre-law students, which was entirely online across Canadian law schools from very unique backgrounds, because these were students getting admitted into the university from marginalized communities. So it really brought to fore the challenges that some segment of our students will be facing in the fall. So I'll leave it there for now and let my colleagues do their bit.
Great, thank you, BC. Maybe I think it would be Lisa's turn if you would like to introduce yourself and give your opening remarks.
Sure, thank you, Derek. Thank you again to Derek and you, David, for the invitation to speak today. So for those of you who I haven't met, my name is Lisa Cirillo, and I'm the Executive Director at Downtown Legal Services.
I did everything I could to get my earphones to work. Nothing works.
Oh, you haven't attached them.
Sorry. Did I just interrupt there? Excuse me. Sorry.
I'll just, if people blank out, I'll momentarily mute all mics every now and then just to sort of try to do background silence, and then I'll have to come back and unmute you. So sorry,
okay.
You're good now.
I stopped talking because I could hear somebody else speaking, but maybe that was not the right thing to do. I will plow ahead next time that happens. So as I was saying, I'm the Executive Director at Downtown Legal Services, which is a long-standing partnership between Legal Aid Ontario and the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. We provide free legal services to low-income clients and also to University of Toronto students in high-priority areas of law. So areas of law like criminal law, family law, employment law, housing law, refugee immigration law. Working under the close supervision of our staff lawyers, our students represent clients before a variety of courts and tribunals in the Greater Toronto area. And just to give you a sense of the scale of our program, we currently have 17 students working with us full-time for the summer. In the academic year, we typically have close to 50 students who do the program for academic credit. And then we have usually another 60 to 70 who are involved in the clinic in a volunteer basis. So we were asked to sort of reflect on, by the organizers, what is we were asked to offer opening remarks, and I'm going to reflect on a theme that's been troubling me or worrying me about the current situation. And then as we get to the questions, I'm going to answer those questions from this lens. So I want to talk a little bit about community. So, you know, as with all parts of life, COVID has completely upended the way in which we run the clinic it's challenged all of the assumptions we have about how we will work with and supervise our students, and even how we practice law. And I think, like many people, we spent the first few weeks in kind of stunned disbelief and denial, and we were sort of scrambling to set up short-term measures for what we thought would be a short problem. Unfortunately, it quickly became clear that the situation was going to continue long enough that we would have to start our summer term online. And then came the next layer of realization that actually we're going to have to run the whole summer online. And now, of course, we're having this conversation because it seems clear that we're going to be at least partially online in the fall. So this strange world has raised a lot of questions for us in the clinical programs, from the big, like how do we supervise and students remotely, to the way more prosaic, like where do we send the mail when the office is closed. But one big existential concern for me has been the question of community. So much of what I love about Downtown Legal Services, and here I will just pause and say, yesterday was my 10th anniversary in the role as director of DLS, and I was many years before that a staff lawyer for 6 years at DLS. I've been with DLS a long time. And what makes that place most magical to me is the sense of community that we have. And although our program is large by a lot of clinical standards, it does offer students the chance to join a smaller bubble within the much larger law school community. And we're very intentional about the kind of community that we strive to achieve and work to maintain at the clinic. We aim to create a creative, respectful, collaborative space that is anchored by our common goal to provide respectful, client-centered legal services, but also that is guided by an ethos of care. And I purposely use the present tense in those things because, of course, we're a community that is constantly refiguring itself as students exit and enter the program. And so this is work that is never done. It's something we work on every day. So, but then I ask myself, like, what does community look like when our staff and students are scattered across the city and the province? And I know in the fall, we're probably going to have students that are scattered across the country. How do we establish a sense of connection with each other? And so as we move through the questions we're going to come to later, I want to reflect on the opportunities and the challenges of the COVID pandemic through this lens of community.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And I will now turn the microphone over to Catherine, who will share her reflections or her opening remarks.
Thanks so much, Derek, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this. My name is Catherine Dauvergne, and I'm the Dean of Law at UBC, and I'm sure that I got the invitation to join today because I'm currently serving a term as the president of the Council of Canadian Law Deans, but I also feel that I'm connected to the CALT conference, as the last time we were in person, we were in Vancouver in our lovely Allard Hall building, and I have many warm memories of that occasion. I'm really enjoying listening to Lisa and reflecting on what she was saying and thinking, I'm not sure that I have anything nearly as eloquent by way of opening remarks, but Derek was asking us to think about what our key concerns and preoccupations have been as we've been involved in this strange shift over the last 2.5 months now. And I think knowing and trying firmly to keep that decanal hat on, because I know that's why you invited me. I really think that some of my most pressing preoccupations are how to plan in a circumstance of really intense unknowability, and faced with that unknowability, how to also preserve flexibility. So without much certainty about what happens in the future, how do we build a vision of the future that allows us to change as information changes? We know so much more now than we did 12 weeks ago, and yet we are planning for an autumn teaching term, which is more time than that away. And that balance between being very flexible in the face of the unknown is a really difficult one to achieve on the administrative side, and something I spend a lot of time thinking about. Another thing that I spend a huge amount of time thinking about is workload. And although part of that is, of course, just my own workload and the rules I have, like I can't have more than 12 Zoom meetings a day, or, you know, many things like that, that for some reason, although many parts of my job disappear under these circumstances, I still have, I'm further behind than I've ever been. And I did in the first few weeks in March, have had a daily email inflow of about 2,000 emails a day, which was actually unprecedented for me. And many of them I've just, you know, let flow away. But so part of the concern about workload is personal, but I actually think one of my real concerns about workload is workload for faculty and workload for students as we think about the shift that we're planning, and particularly not knowing how long we're planning it for, or and not having, you know, there's no extra weeks this summer than there were in previous summers. And one of the things that I've said on many occasions is we really need to sort of focus on the core of what we want to achieve here, and really try to do less, really try to make sure, knowing how hard things are in all different dimensions, to ensure that we are not making things even harder by trying to do more. And I will say more in another round about some of the places where I think that leads us. Thank you very much, Derek.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was quite eloquent yourself. I will now turn the microphone over to Craig, who will share his thoughts and will introduce himself and share his thoughts.
Great, thanks, Derek. So in terms of the hats I wear, I'm the Vice Dean of Graduate Studies at the University of Ottawa. I was also the Vice Dean Academic. And so I come at this both from the administrative perspective at the mid-level, but also at the pedagogical level. I've been using a flipped methodology of teaching, and I can describe what that is a little bit later. Since 2012, I've been using Zoom for some synchronous remote teaching across universities since 2016. And for my sins, I am leading what tongue-in-cheek we're calling Project Moonshot, which gives some indication as to the challenges at the University of Ottawa, which is designed really to take us from where we were in March, which was not really online teaching so much as emergency remote education, to a more sophisticated form of online teaching that has an appropriate balance of synchronous and asynchronous. And so we've retained 17 of our JD and LLM students as Dean's Tech Fellows, and they are training up in pedagogy and delivery of pedagogy online. And the analogy I have is of the, the famous image of the barefoot doctor, where you train people in basic skills and they go out and they propagate that. And so the idea of the Tech Fellows is to propagate that knowledge amongst our faculty. And they're also working on our virtual orientation and our virtual convocation. And frankly, we would be sunk without them. At the graduate level, we're also moving forward with a micro-credential, a fully asynchronous micro-credential that we're hoping to offer this fall to accommodate our graduate students, many of whom will be in a variety of different time zones and therefore unable to participate in synchronous education in any real way. Now, you asked me to share key concerns or preoccupations. And so actually the first question, Derek, is sort of the bummer, because I'm going to try to be more uplifting, but the first question is about concerns and preoccupations. So my concern is that we've seen the earthquake, right? And that's the COVID-19. But the tsunami is the financial fallout, right? And so right now, our pedagogy is being driven by social distancing because of COVID-19. I fear that in a year's time, our pedagogical discussions will be driven by a period of austerity. And both of those things are terrible from the perspective of both anticipating what's to come and also the idea of our pedagogical decisions being driven by these exogenous variables. On the other hand, and I'm going to start to be more uplifting as we progress, I'm always of the view that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And so in the spirit of making lemonade out of lemons, I think this is an opportunity for us to address what I see as some of the systemic shortcomings in post-secondary that have persisted in large measure because we're relatively isolated from the sorts of competitive pressures you find in other sectors. And we have a guild-like quality. And so we've not been the most innovative. And my own view is that there's a lot of room for innovation the question then becomes, and this goes to Catherine's point, how do we innovate in a sustainable manner that doesn't make things worse? And so I'll stop there and leave the follow-up to the future rounds.
Thank you very much, Craig. Yes, and we will talk about both lemons and lemonade in some of the future rounds. So I will turn the microphone over now to Sonia Lawrence, who will share some of her, will introduce herself and share some of her concerns and preoccupations.
I prefer lemons to lemonade. So strangely, I'm Sonia Lawrence. I'm a full-time prof at Osgoode, although everything I say here is just personal views, not institutional. But for the past 4 years, I've actually been serving as the research graduate program director. So for our LLM and PhD programs. But for September, I'm supposed to be going back to teaching public and constitutional law to 75 first years, which I was really excited about. And now I'm slightly less excited about having to do online. But I think some other things for me is like, I'm on lockdown. This is my bedroom. I'm home with my kids who are 12 and 14 and are apparently doing online school. Who knows? My partner is a healthcare worker at a long-term care home that has a really bad outbreak. And actually, at the present time, he is in the basement on strict isolation lockdown that we are trying to manage. We cannot go near him. We have to deal with all that. But before that, he'd been working 15 or 16-hour days. And I think that this kind of close contact with the healthcare sector kind of has been driving a lot of my approach to this, which is I have been very pessimistic from the beginning. And so I've not been particularly surprised by what is happening, at least in the Ontario context. But, you know, I think the reality of my situation right now is that my work life and my non-work life are absolutely coexisting at all moments. And I think that's a significant thing for me, and I'm sure it's a significant thing for many of us, and it drives a lot of the things that other people have been saying without saying them. So those are some immediate contexts, but I also really do remember that we were meant to be meeting in London in person and on the theme Bridging Divides, Confronting Colonialism and Anti-Black Racism, and CULT declined to move the conference virtually for a variety of reasons, but including because the Canadian Black Studies Association said that the normalization of the situation that was happening when SSHRC decided, you know what, we can just put this conference online, was a problem because the nature of the conversations that we needed to have could not happen in the highly individualized kind of panel presentation online model that that SSHRC was offering. And I think that that business as usual normalization approach is one of my preoccupations right now. The need to be able to tell people that what we're doing is just, everything is just fine. We can move things online, watch how we're doing it. And I think that that's got to do with a lot of different facets of our academic work. I'm also reluctant to take the position that anything has really changed over the last 7 days or 5 days of protests. I'm located in Toronto, so this is a live issue in my city, as it is, I think, across Canada. But we knew already about police violence against Black and Indigenous people. We knew already that Donald Trump was utterly unprincipled, totally unhinged, and not governed by law. But I do think that this brings a concern to me about what becomes non-necessary in terms of what we do as teachers and as colleagues, what gets set to the side, despite the fact that it is the context in which we're working, as we try to think about what should we be doing as teachers, how should we be connecting to each other, how should we be connecting to our students. So I think that's, I hope that I can kind of spin out some of those things about the contemporary context and how it should come into our teaching as we move forward.
Thank you, Sonia. We will definitely come back to those points in the discussion today. Shauna, I will turn the microphone over to you.
Thanks very much, Derek. It's really a pleasure just to imagine being with all of you, but listening to the comments so far and being surrounded, feeling surrounded and supported by so many colleagues. So I'm Shauna Van Praag. I've been at McGill for 27 years now, where I have served in the past as Associate Dean Graduate Studies, and I've been past president of CALT. One of the courses I teach is a legal education seminar directed primarily to doctoral students, and I feel very honored and fortunate to have inherited that seminar from Rod McDonald, who taught it for many years at McGill. I think that experience is partly why I now find myself a member of McGill Law's remote pedagogy committee that has been set up for this summer. Some of you who haven't met me or don't know me might know my name through the call for essays that David Sendamirsky at Western and I sent out earlier this spring, looking for essays, and many of you have responded so far. We have extended the deadline by a week in response to requests for an extension from numerous people, but essays on teaching and learning law in the pandemic, and we're looking forward to seeing the collage of views that comes out of that. In terms of a very brief articulation of some concerns I have and some ideas, I suppose I've been thinking a whole lot in a very intense way over the last 12 weeks about presence and proximity as characteristics of legal education in Canada, and things that that we have that are part of the teaching and learning that goes on in faculties of law across the country. The idea that professors are present, that our students are present, that we are in proximate relations with each other, and the ways in which the language of remoteness really challenges that, and in some ways it feels as if that remoteness is destroying or breaking some of the things that we care about and value so much. So I've come up with 3 R's in response to remoteness. First, resistance. So active resistance, taking an approach of resistance to a shift to the remote or the virtual or online. That resistance can, of course, also be constructive, and I will come back to some of the ways in which I think it can and must be. The second R is reflection. Again, it's okay, I think, to sometimes feel somewhat broken and to reflect on what we've learned, what conversations we can have with our colleagues, what we can learn from young people for whom the learning curve has not been so steep, but who may indeed have very interesting insights on the limits of remote learning. And the third are recreation, the challenge to recreate, to insist, as Catherine mentioned, that less can be more, to follow young people in terms of ideas and possibilities, and to take risks together, not so that we can turn remote teaching and learning into ideal or even, I would say, highest quality pedagogy, but that we can look forward past the coming year and do some serious recreation of our roles in legal education and the valuing of the sharing of communities. So I come back to the first one of the first interventions by Lisa. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Shauna. that was helpful in sort of wrapping up the first round.
Actually, Derek, sorry, can I just butt in for 2 seconds? Sorry.
Sure.
BC actually self-censored himself with just his introduction at the start and not his opening remarks. So communicated in the chat. So can we circle back to BC for him?
Sure.
His remark.
Thanks, David. So it's really been nice to hear what my colleagues have shared. And I think it's, instead of repeating them, I'll escalate it in the level of personal worries, which I think various constituencies will share across the continent, the country. So first, I worry as a young professor in a Canadian law school for what this means for me. Maybe not personally, but I worry if I was resuming teaching for the first time as a professor in a Canadian law school. Having not taught before really accentuates that worry in the sense that I don't even know these students, nor have I met my colleagues if I was moving cities. Secondly, I worry about health situations. And I worry about these not just for me, but for communities that are marginalized. We do think about this, not just about indigenous communities, Blacks, but also, you know, white folks who are just economically challenged. Many of the law school students I've taught are the first lawyers in their family, and they're not necessarily Black or indigenous community members. So I worry about them. I worry about mothers who have children who have to contend with school in this period that we're in. I'm concerned about the person who just thinks I don't have what it takes to be part of this community if I must do it virtually. So I think all these, as colleagues have said, just means this is still not normal times. And I don't think this is the moment to really escalate or even reimagine things. Maybe we can reimagine only to a limited extent, to keep it simple, as colleagues have said, to move past what is really a public health challenge, more challenging moment. And I think in that context, you really just stop here. For me, collaboration becomes even bigger in this context. Not just faculty-wide collaboration, but also across universities. Some colleagues are already doing that, but I'll stop here for now. Thanks.
Thank you, BC. Thank you for following up with those preoccupations, which I know a lot of us share. We had said that we would follow up on that opening round by doing another quick round with the panelists, and we can follow the same sequence of speakers. And so, BC, if you would like to go next, we had said we would want to inject a bit of a positive note in part of the discussion, just by doing a round of all the panelists, where we would ask basically, what do you think some of the beneficial impact of what we have gone through has been? Are there things that you are happy we learned how to do because perhaps we wouldn't have learned how to do them otherwise? Are there adaptations that we've made under the circumstances which could be worth preserving for the longer term, even as we eventually come out of the pandemic? So I wanted to just do a quick round and ask if the panelists would like to intervene on that point, and we can possibly follow the same order. If people would like to jump in a different order, that would be all right as well. BC, would you like to go?
Sure, thanks. So it's, you know, as I thought about the question, I do really ask myself, what really is it that we have already learned that we would like to keep? It's a difficult question, and I don't know that we've learned a lot that we need to keep, actually, given the fact that the winter context was really just thrust upon us all, and we just tried to make it work for ourselves. But, you know, without contextualizing it in the context of the pandemic, what Shana said in relation to resilience is a big factor here, right? So I don't know that it is a lesson from it, but it reminds us of something we all have in us. You know, that despite this challenging monster that we're all confronting and all it has raised, we do have a lot to be able to draw on as teams and as individuals to really ride this rough patch. I think in terms of adapting, then that makes more sense, right? It's shown that, okay, despite it all, maybe we're able to do one or two things in a modest manner. So for me, it then brings hope, right, about what is going to come. And to know that as all of this is happening, there are colleagues reaching out. For those who teach, for example, civil procedure, I know they talk about that. I know the contracts guys across the law schools are trying to do something. You know, I've seen Craig's materials that I've used in my classes. So I think if we think about it in that way, then it means instead of existing in silos, for once, this is actually pushing us all out to be in conversation with each other across law schools. And I see that cross-fertilization as a real positive at the end.
Thank you, BC. And I would note, just on that note, we have 130 participants on the call now, which is more than the number of people who had registered for CULT's in-person conference, right? So in some ways, this format has opened some opportunities for connecting with each other from different law schools for that. At the risk of upsetting the preconceived pattern, BC, since you made a reference to Shauna's remarks in your remarks, maybe we can do the order of speakers in the reverse order that we did last time, and I'll pass it to Shauna to pick up on what you said, and then we can go back through the speakers in reverse alphabetical order.
Okay, thanks, Derek. I never get to be at the beginning of the alphabet, so you see this is kind of nice. All right, so I think that this idea of resilience that BC picked up on, and from my remarks, and I'll come back to that, I think it's really, really important. I've been thinking of the pandemic and everything that comes with it as a speed bump rather than a dead end, right? So we slow down, we have to shift gears. That doesn't, but that doesn't mean that we're somehow blocked, or that we can't look ahead to coming back into the classroom. And I think that this gives me, this leads to what I think is perhaps the most positive aspect of the last few weeks, and that is that I think we are pushed to articulate much more clearly than perhaps we ever had what it is about legal education that thrives in the sharing of physical and campus-based space. Because it's too simple just to say, oh, that, I can't imagine legal education or teaching my class outside of a usual classroom, or it's really horrible that we can't all be in the same space. I think we have to be more precise about what it is that we value about bringing people together, about face-to-face interactions, about the incredible ways in which, I think legal education is really quite special on this, that students, and if you think back to when you were a student, that students talk about their particular professor in, well, BC mentioned contracts, so let's say contracts. They don't just say, I took contracts law, right? They'd say, I took contracts with X person. And so the students think of that professor as theirs, and we as professors tend to talk about our students, meaning, right, my section, my students, what we are doing together. And I think that's something very particular and special about legal education in North America, and perhaps particularly across our Canadian faculties of law, that we have unique, and students expect this, unique experiences in learning, even courses that have the same names across all faculties of law. People think of the teaching and learning that happens with one professor with a group of students, even a large group of students, as truly unique and special. And but I do think we need to, if we want to get that back, if we want to insist on the importance of campus-based university learning, and in particular campus-based learning of law, then I think this crisis is pushing us to be more precise and careful about the ways in which we articulate the advantages of sharing actual space, and also understand the stresses and challenges of sharing actual space. So those come with that as well. I won't go into them here, but I think this perhaps will make us kind of more careful about how we think through both the benefits and the challenges of campus-based legal education.
Thank you, Shauna. I will, yeah, I will ask Sonia if she wants to follow up on that.
Sure. I think I really do appreciate the comments on opportunity. I'm still having a really hard time with the language of opportunity. I wish I wasn't, but I am. For me, I think, you know, we're in a time of excess death. We're in a time of suffering. We're in a time of privation. And to the extent that this leads to opportunity, I think I want to say, okay, it's an opportunity to focus on the impact or non-impact of excess death, suffering, and privation on our society, in our lives, and in the lives of our students. So it's an opportunity to think about legal education can and should confront and recognize these issues and the place of law within them. So I'm reminded of this wonderful 2014 piece by Mari Matsuda. It's called Admit the Waters Around You Have Grown, Change in Legal Education. I have pushed it on so many people, and obviously Matsuda is not my discovery, so I'm sure many of you have already read it, but I'm gonna put it in the chat here for you. It's a graduation address, and it's built in some ways around the challenge of climate change for lawyers. But what it reminds me of is that one of the critical roles for law and lawyers is to respond to the unexpected and to problem solve for the unexpected and to advise for the unexpected. And so I think this is an opportunity, at least it has served as a learning opportunity for me, to remember that I should stop predicting the future based on the past, that things are changing, but we can watch the ways that lawyers had to respond to the pandemic as a way of thinking about what legal education needs to offer, right? So we know that Crowns had new decisions to make. They had to think about, despite that there were clear indications that prisons were breeding grounds for COVID-19, they had to make decisions about whether or not they should release people preemptively, whether they should agree to requests for release. Corporate lawyers had new decisions to make. Litigators had to face the shutdown of the physical spaces in which they actually litigate, and massive changes in procedure had to happen on the fly. How did lawyers advise clients, sort out the ethical choices they had to make, adapt to new rules and ways of doing things? And how can we, as legal educators, or how can the regulator or students use what lawyers have had to cope with since March to inform our understanding of what the role and content of legal education should be? So for me, that's one opportunity. I already said that I like lemons, and I meant that literally, but maybe I also actually just prefer the lemons to the lemonade sometimes. Okay, and then I'll say again, because I think it's kind of a similar point, maybe there is an opportunity to recognize the importance of attending to our colleagues with care and kindness, and understanding that our lives are all so much more than our lives at work. Because when we are kind of by force of law confined to our homes, and all of our efforts to balance care responsibilities with work by, you know, whatever methods we use, outsourcing, complex juggling, sharing, arrangements with grandparents, whatever they are, all of those become impossible. Many of us are facing one of the biggest work-related challenges we've ever had. Right, so even recognition of this, though, is a bit of a threat, as many women are finding. So no one wants to be told, oh, I understand you can't do your work because you have small children at home, right? Nor do people want to be invited to disclose their struggles in performing their full-time work in exchange for unspecified arrangements with their employer. And I think, you know, obviously this is particularly true for untenured colleagues, I have tenure, I feel safer talking about this, but I'm still worried about it. These kinds of challenges, that paid work is not the only economic work we're doing, that care work in particular takes a tremendous amount of time, energy, and brain space, and is very unequally distributed, have long been a concern of feminist scholarship. But in this extraordinary situation, like I said, I just find it's not just my brain where all this work is always overlapping and fighting for space, it's in my actual space. I gave very strict instructions that I was not to be interrupted during this particular call, and that appears to have worked, but you know, sometimes it doesn't. You know, I'm working while I'm cooking, I'm working while I'm putting people to bed, I'm being berated for not being helpful in grade 7 math, which any of you who knew me in grade 7 would not be surprised. And how do I take the opportunity to say over and over again with understanding and not with fury, no, perhaps stop talking about all the extra time we have now, to the people who want to talk to me about that? How do I support my colleagues? This is an opportunity. How do I think about how to support my colleagues in the most challenging situations? How do administrators reassure people in these situations and reconfigure work? How do we say, if you don't feel pressure and if you're not suffering, that is great and wonderful, and maybe it's time to ask how you can help? And there's of course a parallel here. I've been talking about professors, but I think there's a big parallel here in terms of thinking about our students, obviously. And then very briefly, I'll say something that actually is lemonade, which is I had the opportunity to have a Zoom call with a very large number of grad program directors from across Canada. That was something that the group was started before COVID-19 by Josh Carton at Queen's, but having a chance to talk through some of the stuff we didn't know and the responsibilities that we were feeling was both practically incredibly helpful, but also felt really supportive. So I do want to, I think that's an echo of BC's comment about the ways that we can find support outside our own institutions. It's not just around teaching and curriculum. It can also be around the other kinds of administrative work that we're doing. Okay, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Sonia. So going backwards in the alphabetical order now, I think that brings us to Craig.
Great. So I'm going to be all lemonade in this round, and I'm going to save the Zoom and Doom for the round 3. So on round 1, we were asked to answer 3 questions. The first was, what are you happy we learned to do? And I'm going to actually cheat. What am I happy that I think we may learn to do? Jury's still out. So what I think may come out of this is that we start to reconceive a law school course as more than simply contact hours, say 3 hours a week, and rather as a bundle of learning hours. And so as soon as we start talking about synchronous and asynchronous education and doing that sort of diagnostic that Shauna recommended, deciding what needs to be done in the classroom and what really can be offshored more effectively online, if you still think about it as a 3-hour unit per week, you're going to overwhelm your students, right? And so how many learning hours is available to the average law school student, given all the equity concerns that BC has raised, the reality they're living through right now with COVID and economic difficulties. And if we do that, I think we're much further ahead than we have been in the past. And that also means that we need to stop thinking about our law classes as effectively fiefdoms run by individual barons and an exaggerated sense of academic freedom. I mean, I'm an international lawyer, right? So I'm quite preoccupied with sovereignty, but even sovereign states can form treaties. Right. And so the cross-fertilization I'm seeing amongst some of my colleagues, including David, and David knows the property law professors who teach sections of property law in our institution are collaborating in a hubs and spokes sort of model. I'm seeing that across some institutions. And I think that's very valuable, both for the pedagogical virtue. Some people specialize in some things and some people specialize in other things, and you get the best of all worlds. Plus that aspect that Sonia raised, which was the idea of a sense of community amongst ourselves in our splendid isolation in lockdown. I think that's very valuable. And so that leads me to the next issue, what new adoptive approaches might be worth preserving. I do think the idea that certain things are best done asynchronously and certain things are best done synchronously is a reality. The pedagogical literature is overwhelming in this area. And if that sticks, then I think people may come out of this with courses that in the end will be flipped or blended that will actually be a lot better than the courses they went into. And so when we talk about making lemonade out of lemons, that's really what I'm talking about. And then I guess the last question here, what valuable opportunities for positive change to legal education as a system has arisen? Well, if you do this properly, it seems to me you can slay that very tedious debate in the law schools between theory and practice, as if these were divergent objectives. And Lisa, I'm looking for you to nod along here, because you and I have had long conversations about how this is a false dilemma. And if you can create space in your classes through adopting these technologies, you can actually do a lot more in a law class than perhaps has been done in the past with more conventional forms of teaching. I'll get to the bummer side in round 2, so let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Craig. And since I'll invoke my chair's prerogative to depart from the pre-established order. Since you gave a nod to Lisa in your remarks, maybe I'll invite Lisa to go next, and then we can give Catherine a chance to intervene right after that.
Okay, thank you for keeping us on our toes, Derek. It's great moderating. Yeah, so I mean, I feel like I've so enjoyed all of the co-panelist remarks. I feel like there's been about a dozen nuggets that I would love to seize on and talk about for the next hour and a half, but I know you have certain questions you want us to get through, and of course you want to leave space for the participants. So I'm just going to stick to, rather than answering all 3 questions in round 1, I'm just going to talk about what is something positive that has come out of this pandemic from my perspective as a clinician and in the world of experiential learning. So although I also would say that being an optimist at heart, I would have done the negative things first and had us end on a positive note. So I like lemonade better, Sonia, than lemons. But so just remember that I have some positive things to say when we get to the next round. So I guess I would say experiential learning at its core, right, is a model of learning that takes students through several well-defined stages. So we have experience, reflection, conceptualization, experimentation, repeat. And a lot of people think of experiential learning as learning by doing, but I want to reassure you it is much, much more than this. So it requires an attitude of ongoing inquiry and curiosity, of evaluation and adjustment. And in the usual course of our programs, we use a mix of clinic work and seminars and case rounds and reflective writing to guide students through all of these stages of learning. Now, as I've already admitted in my opening remarks, we were not at all prepared for what seemed like an overnight reordering of the world as we knew it. And I have to tell you, as the director of a legal clinic, it never occurred to me that I would have to figure out how to run a law office and a clinical teaching facility remotely. But of course, like everyone on the screen, we had no choice. And because we assist real clients with real pressing legal issues that don't wrap up neatly at the end of the term, we didn't have the luxury of pressing pause while we figured this all out. And we had to, of course, shift to this new model of teaching and practicing law under the watchful gaze of our students. So we soon realized, and clinicians, we love to reframe things in positive ways. We soon realized that this opportunity actually offered a really unique opportunity to engage in a giant collective experiential learning opportunity with our students in real time. And once we realized this, we really leaned into the idea. And we explicitly acknowledged this and invited the students along with us. And so what do I mean by that? So our summer term started on May the 11th. And from the very moment that I welcomed them on Zoom to this new world of DLS online, I confessed to them that we did not have this remote world down, that the transition was very much a work in progress and we had big issues to sort out. I talked to them about the fact that we did actually consider postponing the summer term. So there's a school of thought that says you really shouldn't invite students into a program until you got the basics figured out, right? Especially a teaching clinic. If we're supposed to be teaching best practices, is it best practices when we don't have access to our case management software? No. So, there was a school of thought that said we should postpone until we had it figured out. But I think, as we've all discussed already, I'm not sure when we're going to get it figured out. And I feel like that what works today maybe won't work next week. That is, we're all living in this perpetual state of uncertainty and waiting to see what's going to happen. And so we opted to take the plunge hand in hand with our students. In essence, we were sort of like in the Wizard of Oz, inviting them behind the curtain with us and saying, listen, you're along on this journey with us and it's going to be messy and we're going to make mistakes and we're going to learn from them. And sometimes you will recognize that we're making a mistake. And in that circumstance, please let us know. And because, you know, and we taught, again, we sort of as a staff talked about this ahead of time, and we thought there's some really good lessons here for students. So to pick up on some of the things that BC and Shauna talked about, if we think about what are the core competencies we need right now to figure out how to move forward in this new world and continue to serve our clients, actually they're the same core competencies that I would say students need to have if they want to engage in community lawyering. They have to learn how to be tenacious, like really tenacious. They have to learn how to be creative. They have to be adaptable. And perhaps most of all, they have to learn how to practice humility and develop resilience. And so we thought this is a really great opportunity to invite the students into this learning journey with us. And I would say to you, you know, we're in week 4, so all is still new, but the experience of engaging in this messy, inelegant, but I think valiant effort to figure out a way forward with our students, to do this as a collective effort, has opened up some really new and powerful ways of connecting with the students. I cannot rely on my tried and true method of feeding everyone. That's usually step 1 for me in building community. Anyone who's attended any of our cult ACO conferences will know that. I spend a lot of time worrying about feeding everyone, but of course I can't do that in this context. I do feed my staff because I know where they all live, but there's a little too many of them with the students. So, but we are finding creative and new ways of connecting with each other, of course, around the work, that's so important, but also in building community together and sometimes just having fun. That's so important because the kind of work we do, it's really heavy, and we talk about self-care from the Students First Arrive. So we've been figuring out ways of having fun together online. And I shared with the co-presenters, we had a special guest attend our sessions last week. At the time, I assured the student she was not a celebrity, but she is, because she's in this week's edition of Maclean's. We had Buckwheat the donkey join one of our Zoom calls just for pure fun, just so that we could have a laugh together, you know, and remember that we're in this journey together. So I'd say, of course, it's early days in the term, and I'll talk about this a little bit when we get to worries going forward. I recognize this task is going to be way more formidable for us in the fall when we have over 100 students involved in the clinic. But I would say the gift of this dress rehearsal term is that it's reminded me how resilient and tough we are at DLS. And it's given me hope that we can continue to build community even in this weird new normal that we live in.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And I guess Catherine is the only one who hasn't had a chance to speak yet about some of the positive lessons that might have come out of this particular experience. So I'll turn the microphone over to her.
Thank you very much, Derek. I think on the theme of what's positive about this, I probably can be very brief to wrap up this this round. I think the first question that you put to us is, what are you happy that we learned to do? And I think my answer to that is that we learned to change. And I think there are any number of things that we can do with that knowledge and that capacity. And in many ways, I'd like to just bottle up the idea that law schools are capable of change and be able to sprinkle some of that forward in a few really particular ways. There are a few other things that I think have really come to the forefront in this period that I don't know yet if they're positive things, but when I'm trying really hard to be optimistic, I think there are some glimmers there that if we were able to really get the very most out of them, they might become things that we would feel happy about in the future. And so there are a few things that I think we've noticed. So one of the things that we've noticed is that people are capable of much more collaboration than they thought they were, or than they were willing to make time for, or than they felt was appropriate, or whatever the reason. There's a capacity for collaboration that is arising here that's a really valuable and important thing that we might be able to carry forward. I also think we're at a moment where we could, where we really could, as institutions, genuinely think more about what the essence of pedagogy is. As we're really trying to figure out what do we absolutely have to do in this space, there's an opportunity that we rarely get to think, what actually is it that we do when we teach? And we might possibly, and this is deeply ironic in a world of continual Zoom, we might be able to decenter the talking head model of legal education, which we say over and over and over again is not the pedagogically valuable thing. But really, truly, circumstances may finally force us to grapple with that and to understand that if you subject yourselves and your students to 20, 30 hours of Zoom in a week, that it's not sustainable in any way, shape, or form for anyone. And we might finally get around to really seriously decentering that in a meaningful way. I mean, not that we're there yet, but we can see it in a much more urgent way than we could ever see it before. And, you know, just to follow on from the comments that Lisa was making, one of the things we've seen about student well-being in my law school is that students who are in clinical programs, either in the winter term or in the present term, are doing much better in terms of mental health than students who are not in clinical settings. So we can see that that isn't a positive thing, it's just an observable thing. We're just able to pay attention to it in a way that we've not been able to before, and we should be asking ourselves, why is that? We should be thinking about what is the process of learning in that setting, of reflection, of recreation, of one-on-one supervision. What is it about that setting that creates better personal outcomes for people at a time when we're actually allowing ourselves to pay attention to personal outcomes? So I think we've learned that we can change. And my favorite example is at my law school, and this is, you know, I learned to be a law teacher in Australia, which is a very different world pedagogically, in which it was impossible to do. Like, it was just impossible, both morally and within university regulation, to do something that we routinely do in the law school where I teach, which is assess people by 100% final exams, right? And I mean, that's in my own personal view, not my decadal view, oh my goodness, but in my personal view, that's just unconscionable and bad in any number of other ways. But one of the things that we've learned in this moment is that when we tried to think about how do we adjust assessment in April of 2020, that became like an enormous crisis. If people have been doing something for 8 months and you've not assessed them in anything at all, you are so constrained in your ability to maneuver, to adjust, to adapt, to address uncertainty, that you're just completely hooped. And, you know, if the one tiny thing that we got out of this was a capacity to change, like, I don't know, ideological commitment to 100% final exams, which in my mind has no foundation behind it that is addressed in logic. If we could get even that change out of this, I would feel like we'd done something that was, you know, quasi-revolutionary. So the thing I feel optimistic about is some evidence that change is possible, and a few insights into what we might be able to change if we really wanted to take that forward. Thanks, Derek.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Yeah, I think those are very relevant comments. Now, I think that we said we would do another round go through all the speakers and give everyone a chance to maybe touch on the dark side of things, on the detrimental impacts of the pandemic. I mean, some of those are very obvious and we're familiar with them, but we had framed the question in terms of you know, what aspects of legal education do you worry that we're in danger of losing? Who or what are you worried about? What do you hope that we will never have to do again? So maybe we'll just quickly give a chance to all the panelists to finish up with some comments on those. I'm mindful of Lisa's comment. I think it was Lisa who said that it may be, maybe it may have been preferable to start with the negative and then move to the positive after. Maybe I'll compensate for this order of things by just asking all the panelists to be quite brief and just mention if there's something you haven't touched on already that you want to touch on in terms of the detrimental impacts of the pandemic. Please do so now, and maybe we'll go back to the original order. So BC, I think it's your turn. Since you were the first one who commented on the potential positive impacts, I'll give the microphone over to you.
Except I'm going to butt in, BC. Sorry, sorry, BC and Derek. Just to remind people, or ask Derek maybe to remind people about questions. I've had a few coming in, and so if you could just remind Derek, people how to send in questions, so that after this round we head to that.
So David is managing the question and answer session, which will follow the panelists. And if people would like to ask a question, please use the chat function to send it specifically to David Wiseman, and he will manage the speakers list for questions. So thank you, David. So BC, would you like to go now?
Sure. So thanks again, Derek. And I think one point I'd quickly like to note is that while so much has been said, one aspect that I think we haven't highlighted is the impact of all these on research and writing for particularly, academics like me, which is central to our next steps in this journey. Rather than say there is an approach that I have that I want to share, having 2 young children and an equally busy wife who's a lawyer, tending to them now, I think it is something that also deserves some kind of attention, and I'll be interested in hearing colleagues' thoughts on how institutions are supporting young scholars along those lines. Not to say that my institution is not doing very well at that. It's just a thought of a panelist on this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, BC. That's a very important thing to highlight, and it's true. We've mostly been talking about teaching in the context of this panel, but obviously there are a lot of big unanswered questions about the research side of our work as well. Lisa, I guess I'll give you a chance to speak next about anything you wanted to add about some of the things we hope we'll never have to do again, or aspects of legal education that you're particularly worried about, if you haven't had a chance to say them already.
Yeah, sure. I'll be really brief, because also I feel like I just spoke, and so people are going to get tired of listening to me speak. So again, I'm going to come at this from the question of community, and I think this is kind of the flip of what I said a moment ago. The things that have been positive, engaging in this experiential learning experience with our students, is I recognize, as I already alluded to, I recognize it's going to be a lot more difficult for us in the fall. So right now we have 17 of them with us full time for the summer. In the fall, we're going to have over 100. They're going to be balancing the clinic with other courses, with recruitment activities, whatever those look like this year, and possibly extracurricular. And so it's going to be a lot more difficult to try and nurture that sense of community. And I think if we don't do it, or if we have a diminished one, that could have a really negative impact on the students' learning in clinical programs. And I also think it really erodes what they've told us year over year is one of the best pieces of participating in a clinic. So to start with the first part, how might it erode their learning? For many students, the experience of being in a clinical program, it invites kind of by nature a level of intimacy and connection with the staff that I think is different than in the larger law school setting, right? So, and they're exercises of trust. The students need to trust us that we'll support them and catch them as they take baby steps towards the practice of law. And the reality is, when they come to us, because the casework is always ongoing, there's always a huge, steep learning curve. We have to front end load training, and they are constantly being nudged and sometimes pushed right outside of their comfort zones. But we do a lot of work to kind of compensate and assure them that it's normal to feel overwhelmed, but that we're here and we will catch you, and that all questions are welcome. And sometimes it's obvious to us when they need support and when they're floundering. Sometimes it's not. Law school students are used to being overachievers, and sometimes it's hard for them to ask for help, and they're good at masking it. But if they don't ask us for help when they need it, that's a real problem. It's a problem, of course, for their learning, But in a clinical setting, it can also be a problem in terms of the clinic's reputation in our broader community of legal service providers, and most importantly, it can impact a client's case. So I worry that without that sense of supportive community, you know, we're going to get into difficulty there. Also, I worry about how we're going to effectively supervise students, particularly right now. It's a little artificial because most of the courts and tribunals are still pressing pause or opening up just in a really small way. So for like set dates or judicial pretrials, we haven't had like a full-on hearing. And when I think about all that can go wrong if we have to run a full-on hearing on the phone, or, I mean, the courts are talking about Zoom nonstop and, you know, a sidebar. I wish someone would talk to them about the fact that most of our clients, many of our clients don't have access to a phone, let alone a computer that would run a Zoom hearing. But if we're still in this remote world where we can't be together, how are we going to appropriately supervise students who are doing hearings when the student is in one place, the staff lawyers in another, and the lawyers in the third? So, and I think that there's a real problem. Students often, when they first start to do advocacy at the clinic, they revert to like bad stereotypes of lawyering that they see on TV, and we spend a lot of time kind of drumming that out of them. And I just worry that if we don't have the appropriate supervision in place, it's going to really deteriorate the quality of, I think, the quite rigorous program we have in place. And then just lastly, from the student's perspective, in terms of the things that survive their clinical experience, you know, in clinical programs, we wear so many hats with the students, because some of the students will join us in year one as a volunteer, and then they'll summer with us and they'll do the full year credit program. Some of them come back and do the one-term full-time credit program. So we spend a lot of time with them. And in that time with them, we play so many roles. We're teacher, we're mentor, we're sometimes employer, sometimes armchair therapist. I know I spend a lot of time talking to students about their struggles and challenges in law school more generally, and you know, their angst and trying to figure out what kind of law do they want to do and how to get there. And we spend a lot of time talking about how we can support them. And you know, at the risk of being completely immodest, we get really good reviews from the students who do the program. But what I always find interesting is to talk to them 5 years out, 10 years out, because they stay in touch with us. And the thing that sticks with them is the sense of community and safety and the sense of like a home base in the law school. That's so important for them. I think clinical programs, particularly clinical programs that are like ours, so we're a poverty law clinic, it attracts a certain subset of students. And to me, it's not surprising that there's, you know, if we talk about Venn diagrams and overlapping constituencies, like I would say a lot of our students are struggling to find their space, their comfort zone in the broader law school community. And the clinic becomes that home. It becomes the place where they start to feel welcome, where they feel welcomed, hopefully from the get-go, but that they start to feel like, yes, I do belong here. Yes, I do see myself in the practice of law, and I do see a path forward for me. And so, you know, that is so important to them. That's the thing that stays with them. And I worry that if we're in this virtual world, like that piece of it's going to disappear. And I think that would be a real shame.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'll turn it over to Catherine now.
Hi. I'm realizing every time I unmute, it disconnects my earphones, and there you go. That's just the technology. The question of what's hard and what we hope we'll never have to do again is actually a pretty enormous one. And I think I'm really just going to focus on the last little bit of that, which is what am I most worried about? And I think what I'm most worried about is really inequality and the way that inequality intersects with community. I think one of the things we've really learned is that in-person is better for all sorts of things. There are some great things that we can do technologically in our classrooms and our courses, but to have no access to in-person as an option is really hard. And I think that that it impairs all sorts of things that we do for our students, but also for ourselves as faculty, and also for our staff, for those people who work at law schools and help make things tick, and whom we really haven't mentioned this morning at all. And here in Vancouver, it's still morning. But my biggest worry is that inequalities and distinctions between our students, between ourselves, between our staff that we have sometimes been able to attune to and to mediate at the margins are really attenuated in these circumstances, and new kinds of inequalities emerge. And there's so much that's absolutely urgent that we're trying to work our way through right at the moment, that we aren't able to, there's so much that we can't get right, and there's so much that is suboptimal, that the edges of inequality are getting harder and sharper, and our capacity even to talk about them, pay attention to them, and do anything at all that might count as some gesture towards mitigation is really impaired. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Just following the order, I will ask Craig to join in now.
Great, thanks, Derek. So the first question is, what do you hope you'll never have to do again? And I don't want to ever be in administration again, never. So I've been practicing, in front of a mirror saying, no. And my transition manual is going to have a whole chapter on what to do in a global pandemic. But more seriously, the thing that I feel that we've made some gains on, and this goes to Catherine's comments about the exam-based model and the passive learning, talking head, lecture-based model. I mean, Anne Rochette put together her doctoral dissertation a decade ago, and at that time we were, notwithstanding all the discussion to the contrary, largely a lecture-based, exam-driven discipline. I don't think anything's changed except in the margins, and I have some data to support that. If we make any gains on that front, that is that passive education is not the way to go, active learning is better, offshore the passive stuff to more effective ways. I think if we never have to make that discussion or have that discussion again, I think we're well ahead. The next question is, what valuable aspect of legal education have we lost or in danger of losing? Well, the thing that the in-person environment provides that for those of you who have been teaching online know is evaporates very quickly in a form like this is the serendipity. The serendipity of an in-person classroom discussion, which is almost impossible to emulate on an online forum like this. It's all choreographed online, and you have to be way more choreographed. And choreography has its virtues, but in a seminar where there's a cut and thrust and a back and forth, I think that's really valuable. And it's something, in terms of, Shauna, your diagnostic of things that we can't replicate online, that's one of them for me. And then in terms of what worries me the most, well, I mean, where should I start? But just, to cut to the chase here, I am worried that we won't adopt these mechanisms or adapt to the present circumstances. So all the things in my lemonade list, I'm worried that we won't be able to pull them off. Obviously, that worries me. On the workload, and this goes to Catherine's point and points made by Sonia, I'm worried that the law schools are under a lot of pressure now to what I call reinvent the welfare state. What are we going to do for all our students who are in these difficult circumstances? And by we mean basically a handful of faculty members who are suffering under their own circumstances and all of a sudden have to create a new environment that we've never done before. It has enormous workload and frankly psychological implications for staff and for faculty. And I worry about sustainability an awful lot. And last, in terms of my worries, I worry about student expectations. And so some people have said in this discussion that less is more and we have to keep it simple. That is not, it seems to me, the expectations that our students will have coming into September. They gave us grace in March, but my sense from early discussions from students, they're pulling full freight, paying tuition. They expect for us to up our game. And so I am worried about that as well, managing student expectations, given all the constraints we've been talking about in this venue. So that's a bit of a bummer to end the conversation on, but it's all your fault, Derek, for putting this topic last.
Thank you, Craig. No, we will, the conversation is not over yet, so there will be chances for other forms of bummers to come as we keep going. I will turn the conversation over to Sonia now.
Okay. Well, I'm in my happy place now, so I'm very pleased to be talking about things I'm worried about. But let me start though by thanking everybody on the panel, because I've really benefited from all of this, including like a little bit of training on how to be a little bit more optimistic, but also so many of the things you said. I think Lisa said this already. I have lots of notes now and ink all over my fingers, which is nice for a change. So I'm going to take it out of context a little bit because I want to think about some of the things that are outside the law school that I'm really worried about. And, you know, I'm thinking about the institutions that have an enormous impact on us. And the two that I'm going to mention, although I'm only going to take up one, is basically provincial higher ed policy and the regulator. Right, so I am really worried about the future of higher ed policy in Ontario, right? I think governments are going to have to make critical choices about the future of higher education. And it's really unclear to me how provincial governments will respond in terms of funding higher education in the aftermath or in the thick of it, depending on whether we get to the aftermath in the near future or not. So as we look at extreme economic uncertainty, one possibility is that higher education will seem more valuable to, let's say, a government like Ontario's than it has in the past, either in terms of education or in terms of just a warehouse for excess labor. But access to higher education and in particular law schools with deregulated tuition might be even more compromised. But beyond just questions of tuition, which are fundamental baselines for me, I think, you know, the Ontario government has been trying to reorganize funding to institutions of higher education along the lines of the British REF, but with funding contingent on a wider range of measures, including job attainment and job and income attainment by graduates. So that process was finally frozen in April, like they were moving forward with it even during the beginning of lockdowns, and then they finally froze it. But what is this going to mean for who our students are actually going to be, but also for what resources we can marshal into the future? And I think those are really big questions because I thought that, you know, the agenda for the future would have to be to somehow get ourselves back to not reinventing the welfare state within the law school, but somehow get us back to a situation where we actually have higher education that's accessible and funded by taxes. And I don't even know what to think about that agenda now. I'm also, I think sort of related is a concern I have about generational justice, maybe is a one way to say it, and renewal in the academy. So I'm worried about this because I'm a grad program director. I have all this close contact with amazing young scholars, some of whom are really committed to a future in the academy. And it doesn't take a genius to foresee hiring freezes and drops in hiring dollars. And, you know, I've already had to have several of those conversations admitting that I have no idea what will actually be happening in the future. But for those who have, you know, I think this is something that we might need to talk about in terms of how salaries are distributed within the academy, which is a possible, we might describe it as an unfairness in itself. So how are we going to ensure that we keep bringing new voices into the academy and that we continue a process of renewal? I was struck because I was watching Professor, you guys, some of you might know him, he's a labor law scholar at Melbourne, Ju Chung Tam, and he was doing a little kind of education thing on YouTube because at Melbourne, where he is working, they are having a rollback of a promised salary increase. And one of the things he was talking about really, I think, was what would you trade salary for? And I understand that, like, a lot of us are reluctant to think about this at all, but there's a couple of things that I would trade salary for. And one is the promise of more equitable distribution of salary across our faculty, and that would include like the option of hiring, like the possibility of hiring, which I think is critical. And then also well, anyway, I'll leave that one. But I think that, you know, the possibility that discussion about this is coming is, I think, it's on the table. We can look at colleagues in Australia, and I think it's time for us to kind of think about what does that actually mean? Are we going to have any renewal? And part of that, just to take one more step into my anxiety about the future, is I really would be so interested in trying to create learning environments, and I think I have tried but usually failed, to create learning environments in my more kind of non-clinical, in my non-clinical teaching, all of my teaching is non-clinical, that have some aspect of what Lisa was talking about, that try to create some kind of space within which students can be vulnerable, like can let go of the pretend mastery, and can also like ask the questions that actually matter to them and find the kinds of support that might actually matter. And I agree with Craig and Catherine as well, that we know there's problems with the talking head model, but the reality of the fall at my institution, and I'm not sure if this is the same across the country, is we have not shifted the size of classes. The size of classes is still the same. And if we are not getting renewal, that is not going to get better. And if the size of classes is one of the major barriers to us really connecting with our students, I just worry that we might be headed more towards the UK Australian model of class size than away from it. So those are a couple of the things that I'm interested in going forward, but they're, you know, as you can see, they're not as doom laden, you see, because I wasn't optimistic. So this is how I make it all better. This is how I make it work.
Thank you, Sonia.
Thanks.
And I guess we'll turn it over to Shauna now for the last word on this doom laden round.
Okay, so a few days ago, one of our McGill Law students who's been working in a long-term care home in Montreal for the last 5 weeks wrote an open letter to the Premier of Quebec about the situation in long-term care homes. And in that letter, he wrote, after 11 weeks of this crisis, repeating, "It's going to be all right, ça va bien aller," starts to lose its punch. And so I think that feel of, you know, ça va bien aller, the rainbows in the doors of every home in Quebec, I think it's, and here I actually think it's okay to end on the, what are we really worried about? What are the possible, and my co-panelists have expressed many of them extremely well and in provocative and articulate ways. What are the you know, the things that we as educators should indeed be very worried about. So I'll try and be very, very brief so that we can get to the questions and answers and as dynamic a conversation as is possible in this kind of medium. And I'll just go back to my resistance, reflection, and recreation for a moment. So I think I would urge resistance to any language or narrative that sounds as if it's better to go to full online delivery of knowledge than to hold on to campus-based learning. And so for many of the reasons that others have talked about, but I do think that we will need to articulate, I'll go back to what I said earlier, articulate very clearly why in-person is better. Why? Because when you start to read the stuff from coming out of institutions that specialize in online delivery of education, there's a whole lot about individualized accessibility, flexibility, the advantages of online learning that actually sound very attractive, right? Very responsive to all of the individuals who want to be learning, people for whom the commute takes a whole lot of time out of their day, people for whom it's hard to manage all of their responsibilities along with actually coming to school. And I think that a lot of the language also that comes along with online delivery is the reduction of stress, the eradication of strenuous learning circumstances. And the guidelines that just came out from McGill on flexibility and inclusiveness in the time of COVID-19 include, for example, a warning about how to talk about COVID-19 in the classroom, and indeed a warning that this may be too stressful to actually talk about the pandemic. And now it's followed by an indication that, of course, with appropriate guidance, it may be a fine and a good learning opportunity to use examples from the pandemic. But I worry about this. I really worry that this language of kind of safe learning, stress-free learning, flexible and accessible learning will push us towards online delivery and away from campus-based university interaction. So this brings me to the second worry, more in a reflective mode. I think that perhaps we should all start answering the question, what do you teach? With the answer, we teach law students, rather than we teach whatever the topic is that you teach, right? International law or contracts, or in my case, torts. Why? Because there is a risk as we shift into remote or virtual delivery, that what could be and should be constructive, collaborative conversations and help from each other with sources, and this is something that BC mentioned, is happening not just within our faculties of law, but across our faculties of law, that can shift pretty quickly to an old and tired and worn out, but still out there notion of black letter law or doctrinal law, or this idea that some of our courses are things that don't require actual individualized teaching, but could indeed be turned into a set of uniform lectures that law students across the country can just click into. And I wouldn't be surprised if a market emerges this fall for, across law students for, the best lecture on consideration is X professor, click here. So on one hand, it's a bit of a paradox. On one hand, we I think, welcome, and other panelists talked about this, welcome conversations and some collaboration. And on the other hand, and this goes to the concerns about budgets for on-campus university learning, for the next generation of professors, for the idea that we are professors, teachers, and scholars, so that research and writing and and community based participation and leadership have to be part of what we do. We're not 24-hour-a-day online teachers available one-on-one in virtual formats vis-a-vis our students. And so I guess I'll just end with the fact that for many years now, I promised my students in the first class of my big courses that nothing that goes on in the classroom should be replicable online. Nothing that we do together should be something that they could click onto in their pajamas on their sofa at home, because that's my responsibility. And it's their responsibility, right? To be present. It goes back to my notion of presence and proximity. And so I suppose, and this is a hope rather than optimism, which I think is, but the hope is that, and Craig has said this as well, that maybe we will finally get this, and that we will actually learn it from young people who tell us, we're very good at all of these mechanisms and we have all the hardware, but there's something very special about going to university, coming together. And I guess I'll just end with the fact that in Quebec, playgrounds just opened 2 days ago, and we all kind of reminded ourselves about how important play and actual physical encounter is for kids. And I think the equivalent is coming to university and sharing space.
Thank you very much, Shauna, for ending on that eloquent note. We've done a few rounds with all the panelists, and I know that it was our intention in organizing this forum to give other people a chance to intervene as well, either with questions or comments or observations. And as the panelists have been speaking, I know that David Wiseman has been collecting questions and interventions from some of you. So it was my intention now to turn the chairing over to him in a way to cue people who wanted to ask questions or make an intervention, a brief intervention, obviously. Given the time that we have, we had said that we would end by 3 p.m. Eastern time, which doesn't give us too much time, but we can talk a little bit longer.
Thanks, Derek. One thing I have to study in preparing for the fall is Zoom hygiene. So I don't know if it would be appropriate at this sort of moment in a Zoom session to say, hey, stretch a bit, you know, or something. But remember, take off your headphones if you're going to step away from your computer, or you'll give yourself an injury. But you might need to get the blood circulating a little bit. I think that's Zoom hygiene is mentioned on page 45 of Craig's guide to using Zoom manual. So I'll have to check that afterwards. Anyway, that's enough momentary head clearing. I'd like to call on, there's a bunch of questions and I'm going to try to group them a little bit thematically. So I wanted to start off by inviting Kerry Frock and Audrey Macklin to offer their questions, which are on a similar topic and are primarily, as stated, offered or aimed at Craig and some of his thoughts about synchronous, asynchronous teaching. So Kerry is going to state her question first. I'll ask her, and then once Kerry said her question, then we'll move to Audrey. And I'll ask both of you to unmute your own mic, unless I find you in the list first.
Hi, my question is in relation to flipping, and I've made some brief forays into the flipped classroom. I attempted to do it again once we moved completely online with having recordings and then using class times to mostly work through problems. Massive resistance from the students. They said it took too long to listen to the recordings. They didn't like what they saw as doubling up on class time, having to listen to recordings and then come to class and do coursework during that additional time. So I'm just wondering from Craig or maybe any of the other panelists that have tried flipping, how do you get student buy-in, and what are some best practices for flipping? I think one thing that I learned in talking to my students and talking to others is that maybe my recordings were too long, and I think I'm going to try again this fall, and one of the things I'm probably going to do is have 20-minute modules and have students maybe listen to, I don't know, 3 or something, and then we'll do hypotheticals and other problems in class. But yeah, I just wanted Craig to weigh in on that.
And Audrey.
Right. First, let me just briefly thank everybody who is participating in this. I've enjoyed listening to your ideas and thoughts and suggestions and insights. So I'm very grateful for that. And in the spirit of collaboration, I wanted to mention that I'm organizing a meeting of all administrative law teachers on June 11th. I've tried to reach out by email to everybody I know who teaches administrative law to participate. If anybody on this call teaches administrative law and would like to participate in that, please reach out to me and I'd be happy to join you to the list. The question I had was that Craig mentioned that there's more to be said about how to think through what can be optimally taught or should be taught either in person or, if necessary, synchronously online versus what can be, in his language, offshore, taught asynchronously or whatever. And I wondered if he could just say more about that division of pedagogical labor and what he thought, how he thought that could work. I realize that is, in a sense, part of what one does. That's what one does in the flipped classroom. But I thought if you could give concrete illustrations, that would be great. Thanks a lot.
Sure. Thanks very much for the questions, and they're excellent questions. And So first, Carrie, on your concern about flipping and the resistance of students, this has been a perennial concern over the years for students who have been habituated to passive learning, moving to an active learning model because, you know, they get to this habit, just tell me what the rule is, and is it going to be on the exam? And so one of the issues has always been expectation management, and it's really hard, I think, and it would have been really hard in a term to switch gears. In fact, in the same class, it's hard to switch gears. And so if you go in the same classroom session from passive to active, it often falls on its face. At least that's been my experience. So over the years, what I've tried is I have a shock and awe syllabus that I use for expectation management, which basically says you're all in or you're not in at all. Take another section. And so when students actually register for my course, they're adult learners. They make their choices. I tell them what they're in for. And then I actually spend some time, and I'm going to do this again. I'm going to actually have a recorded module for this, explaining why I am using this approach. And I walk them through the performance indicators. And I tell them that this will actually make them better equipped to practice law, that they'll know what an affidavit is by the time they get out of law school, that they'll know how to do a draft notice of application for judicial review, because we're going to do it together. Because what I've done by flipping, by taking the passive and offshoring it, is freed up all this space for feedback that I was never able to give before because I was so busy, you know, rehearsing my prepared lectures. And so I found that generally students, I don't get many students really pushing back at me anymore. And maybe I'm a bit older, you know, I'm scarier, I don't know. But it seems to work. Now, your question is one of design. It is true that students will tell me my course is more work than a conventional course. And I think that's part because a lot of students just wait to the back end of the term and cram. Right. And so the fact that my course requires them, because of the active learning, to stay on pace, I think means that it feels like more work. But it is more work, I think, because when I built my course the first time, yeah, I had reduced versions of my standard lectures, which I turned into podcasts, but I don't think they were reduced enough. And so in version 3 of my rebuild, my modules are going down to 25 to 30 minutes. There are videos as well. In fact, on some of the videos, like I just finished Vavilov, administrative lawyers will find this, you know, probably resonates with them. For Vavilov, like there's little breaks in Vavilov that whether you're actually changing gears. I have like an intermission. I actually have this little banner come down on my video and I play some cheesy music and I said, now please take an intermission. And when you get back, flip to these paragraphs, right? And so if you build your modules so that they're succinct and they're bite-sized, I think they're more digestible for students. And then, you know, what I'm doing this semester, frankly, is the material that's asynchronous. I don't have to make up that time in the classroom, right? So I am not giving them asynchronous material and then giving a 3-hour-a-week active learning exercise. I'm going down to an hour and a half, in part because Zoom will be less adequate for those active learning exercises. So I'm not piling on. And this actually segues into Audrey's comment about what I call learning hours. So the expectation, the soft expectation, is I have always understood it in the law school, is that a full-time roster of courses is the equivalent of a full-time job. And so if you're carrying the standard load of 5 courses and you divide that by 40 hours, that's the number of hours I have per week to work on my course, which includes the synchronous and asynchronous time. And so what I've done essentially, Audrey, is I've gone through, well, how many hours or how many minutes of asynchronous lectures am I expecting them to do? How many active learning exercises are they doing on our learning management system, Brightspace? How long should that take? How many readings am I giving them? And how long is it going to take them to do this reading? And I plug that all in to what I assume should be the base workload for my class. And if you do, it's an interesting exercise. I've never done that before. And you know, over the years, I've actually, as I've started thinking about this, really reduced drastically the amount of reading I give them. In part because I'm concerned about the net impact. And do I really need them to read this obscure case that's 40 pages long that has one simple premise that I need them to know? Well, not really. And so where I've actually done a lot of pairing is on the readings to square it within that time framework I feel that I have for my students. I hope that's responsive to your questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. I think BC can add something on this as well.
So thank you very much. I think Craig has said a lot, but what I think I'm maybe pushing back on, maybe on Craig's point, is that this is not perhaps exactly the moment for the flip, in my view. If you ask me, I've tried it in part in my classes at UND Law and at Dalhousie as well. I do think that one point I could put on the table is the need to reduce, which came out in the general remarks we're making. And that even in the context of the synchronous times we'll have, it's really a reduced portion. I don't know what I'll do in an hour and a half with my students in there. And maybe one more idea to tag on to that is that in participating, that they'll get, marks along the way. This may mean more grading for us, and some colleagues have shared this. It's not original to me, but I think that will motivate them. And it ties to what Shona said in the previous rounds, that reimagining just for this moment that we're in, our evaluation ideas is part of the entire process. Thanks.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that topic from the panel, or shall I move on? You feel free to wave at me. Okay, so I'll move on then. The next question that I'm going to invite is from Pooja Palmer. So Pooja, I'll invite you to unmute your mic and state your question if you're
Hi, thanks, David.
available.
So I also want to just start by saying that I've really appreciated this conversation. So thank you for organizing it. So one of the questions, or one of the challenges, the big challenge that I'm thinking about as I'm planning for the fall, is how to facilitate online conversations on issues that really challenge our students, or topics that students disagree on fundamentally. And because in the past, some of these conversations that happen in the class, or disagreements, and disagreements do happen on race, gender, or the history of the profession, or of professionalism, when they happen in the class, they sometimes continue after the class. Students will tell me they argued some more later, and so on. And so in the past, being in the law school, physically present in the law school or in the student lounge, students have sometimes found me walking in the hallway or come to my office to share their concerns. Students in the past have also sometimes felt comfortable emailing me because they've known me from a different class, or because we've spent time in the class building a sense of community, have emailed me their concerns, or sent rants about this, that, or the other. So I'm just wondering if people are thinking about these kinds of things, how they're planning to make this possible online, in the online environment, or does this mean, because I'm worried about kind of my own well-being, the well-being of students, students being alone and dealing with some of these complex issues that really challenge them. And so I'm guessing this requires support for students, certainly requires supports also for instructors. And so I would be curious about ideas that people might have about how we might do this. Thanks.
Sorry, I see Sonia and I see Shona and Catherine.
So just very briefly, I'm going to be teaching constitutional law in the fall to a new group of law students who typically I've spent a lot of time, trying to make sure that I know everyone's name, inviting them to get to know each other in ways that have nothing to do with school, even if only relatively superficially, introducing them to each other, setting up classroom space, and doing a lot of that work to try to deal with those situations that you describe. And when we get to those topics, sometimes those are topics actually that I hadn't anticipated would be a huge problem. Sometimes they're the ones that you anticipate will be a problem. And in the fall, I'm teaching the course on race in the law, in the winter, which will be, again, will mostly be for first year students. So all that to say, Pooja, I'm also very concerned about this, and maybe we can have a roundtable just for, dealing with difficult issues and online teaching. I would be happy to kind of set that up if people are interested. But one of the things that I wanted to put in here is, yeah, I see that in the chat. Okay, perfect. You guys can all send me an email if you want to be part of that roundtable. But one of the things that I'm worried about is so I'm worried about what you're talking about, because given my experiences in the classroom, I think absolutely that people process these in ways that require them to kind of find you and talk to you later. It always takes a lot of time, but I just don't understand how that will happen. And then, but the opposite is also a worry, that people will just be so disengaged that nothing will happen. And that nobody will get excited or interested in anything, let alone fight about it. So, so I am struggling kind of with how to do these things. And about the support part, I think, you know, one of the things that this might do, I'm a person who loves to be in my office. I don't like to work at home, actually, ever. And one of the things this might do is highlight the importance of us being accessible through happenstance. Like, I don't know, my office is in a corner, right? You don't just happen to walk by my office, but students happen to walk by my office. So anyway, I am really interested in this. I'm going to be seeking some particular guidance on it, but I suspect a lot of what it's going to mean is a huge amount of upfront work before you even get to the topics. And inviting students to participate in that upfront work, inviting them to talk about how those things can be handled. But anyway, Shauna probably has other suggestions.
Well, I was just going to say that I think this really points to the ways in which we all know that the learning that our students do happens as much in the corridors or the coffee houses as it does in the formal classroom context, and that is something that we're going to feel a very acute loss because and so, I mean, some tips or suggestions. I think that one of the things that my guess a lot of us are going to be doing with first year groups, but also I think in seminars where we raise challenging issues, is actually, and it'll be easier for those of us who have some years of experience. So we can actually share the kinds of conversations that have happened before that we remember. So we can say, at this point, one might imagine some of you are thinking this and some of you might respond this and this might happen. And just because, and I know that sounds somewhat artificial, but it's very difficult to get people to push people to have the kinds of conversations online. On the other hand, you can do it to some degree in the breakout rooms, right? There are some breakout possibilities in small groups. How do we manage difficulty or discomfort in those small groups when you can't kind of be in the classroom and watch the body dynamics of people, like how people are responding and talking with each other in the small groups? That's a huge challenge. And I think, again, through all of this, I think we have to be very careful about the promise of individualized engagement and safety that a lot of online narrative offers. This idea that if you feel uncomfortable, you can just click off, right? So, and we know that classroom discussions can become really difficult and uncomfortable and hard, and that's exactly what our offices, that's why we're in our offices and we're open and we're available to students. And so that, I think you've put your finger on something that that can't quite be replicated, and that we really have to think quite creatively about how to try to make some of these connections. And if it's possible where you are, and if some of your students are actually in the particular city or site where you are, to encourage people to go for walks and talks with appropriate protocols, that's one way to imagine, at least, even if you can't participate in them, but imagine those conversations.
Thanks, Shauna. And Catherine wanted to comment as well.
Yeah, so Shauna and Sonia have said a lot of the things I was thinking, but I think, Pooja, thank you so much for the question. It's a really important one, and I think it pushes us to a lot of things that we've covered on the panel, which is we're not going to be able to do everything that we can do when we're with our students in our law schools. And we need to be careful and make thoughtful choices about what we do and what we don't do. And I think one of the things about law school is it is a space for very hard questions. And if we don't ask those questions and create a way for those conversations to occur, then we're really not teaching our students the singular most important things that they need to learn. So we're not going to be able to cover everything. We're going to have to cover these things. And some of the things that you could just read on a book or watch on a video, you can let go of those. And we need to shrink the size at which we deal with these things. So we're keeping a timetable at our law school so that people can use classrooms that are appropriately social distanced. I would focus my pedagogical choices on, there are not going to be very many times when I can sit down with 15 or 20 people, which will be the sizes we can put in our classrooms. Use them for this. And think about the ways in which you take up Shauna's mantra of resistance, reflection, and recreation about what's really important. I don't think we can do this on Zoom screens. And I think that if we embark on doing this on Zoom screens, just as though it were any other discussion, we're really at a serious risk. And I think we need to also say these things out loud to our students. And finally, because I know how to help people technologically, because, 14 hours a day on Zoom has to yield some learning. If you want to keep the chat, go to the More button and it'll save the chat onto your desktop. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. So I'm conscious of the time and that Derek is a very diligent moderator of a session whose bad side one would not want to get on in terms of timing. So we do have a few more questions, but we've only got 3 minutes. So I'm not sure, Derek, whether it's worth starting a question now, or perhaps we should do some sort of little close, and then people could stay on a bit longer if they wanted to, and we could perhaps take some more questions depending on everyone's availability.
Well, one thing we could do, I mean, we can say, we had said the meeting is officially going to end 2 minutes from now, and I know some people might have time constraints. So we could say thank you to everyone. Thank you for coming. We appreciate everyone's participation in this panel. I wanted to say a few thank yous, well, to you, David, to all of the panelists, also to some of the other people who helped organize this session. So that includes Richard Devlin, Sarah Ross, David Sandomierski, who are some of the people behind helping make this session happen. So I wanted to mention that specifically. And just to put in a word that, again, the CALT annual general meeting will be tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern time. I will send out a reminder with the Zoom link to everyone on that a little bit later. I also forgot to mention, which I should have mentioned at the beginning, that we will be presenting CALT's annual awards right after the annual general meeting. So there will be, it won't be all business, it will be some fun as well, and a chance to recognize some of the achievements of our colleagues. So maybe we can treat this like the time in a concert where the band walks off stage and everyone applauds, and there's a little bit of a finale. If there's people who want to go now, this is the meeting can be officially over. But for those who want to stick around and continue the conversation, maybe we can keep going for half an hour or so for those of you who have the time and energy for a little bit more Zooming this afternoon, or I guess it's afternoon in BC now as well.
And Derek, just as people are making that decision and working out what to do, David Sandomierski just wanted to briefly say something, if he's still on, about the project that he and Shauna are inviting people to contribute to. David, I don't know if you can chime in.
Oh, I am here, but Shauna already said it at the beginning, which is just a reminder that our call for essays is open until this Friday. So 2,000 words, no footnotes. We encourage you to select any format you like. We've been getting a terrific range, and it's an opportunity to just put some thoughts down on paper, and what we seem to have so far is very, very promising. So if you haven't had an opportunity yet, please don't put pressure on yourself, but please take an hour or two, if you're interested, to putting down some thoughts about about law and learning in the time of pandemic, and we'll be very excited to read them. So until Friday is a great time. So thank you all very much.
So David, do you want to take it from there again and see if any of the people who had asked questions or wanted or been on the list for interventions might still be on the call and want to participate?
Yeah, so while I triage that, I know for sure that David Sandomirsky is still on the call. So David had a question, which perhaps we can go to, David, which some people might want to respond to, and then I can check who else is still here.
Sure. Well, to a certain extent, Craig and BC have already addressed this, but I just wanted to take up the point that this is an opportunity to, as Catherine mentioned, to think beyond the 100% final. As Lisa mentioned, to think about integrating theory and practice. And but we all have these workload concerns, both students and faculty. So I'm just curious about if people have creative suggestions for how to incorporate multiple assessments, integrated with live participation that can do some of this work and get some of the benefits that we want, but still reflect workload concerns. So I'm just really curious as to people have creative suggestions or ideas on how to do that, because that for me is a big goal.
So I see Craig has a hand, and Shauna, and I think that was his hand from Sonia.
A great question, David. And my wisdom on this comes from a series of mistakes over the last 8 years that, in terms of the sustainability of the project I undertook when I flipped my administrative law class, right? So I went with a model that took all that time that I had offshored as passive education, and I put all that time into feedback, but it became a Frankenstein monster, right? The classes grew. My class started with 60 and it's now over 90, right? So it just becomes unsustainable. So this summer I am completely rebuilding my course, and not just re-recording the passive lectures, which, by the way, when I record them now, I'm not going to be stupid. I'm recording as a unit the stuff that will never change. Like, it won't change in 1,000 years. And that's one unit that I know I'll never have to update. And then for the stuff that's more likely to change, I'll have a separate unit so I can just update that on a regular basis. But on the feedback, which I think is just elemental, and it's the real virtue of the flip. Like, the flip is all about giving time for feedback. There is feedback that I need to give that's very personal, so having students do a draft memo to a partner and a draft notice of application, I need to go through that. But do I really need them to sort of give me feedback on stuff or give them a bespoke feedback on stuff that's more mechanical? Probably not. So I've used our Brightspace, or I'm in the midst of using our Brightspace learning management system, to create fairly sophisticated quizzes that are competency-based, right? So in order to progress from one module to the next, you have to succeed on a pass-fail basis with one of those quizzes. As you're answering the questions, a little video of me will pop up and it'll say, oh, have you considered this? Well, what about this other alternative, right? And so I haven't quite managed to do it yet. I mean, I'm sort of working through the summer on it. But it's very much driven by my concern that bespoke feedback is just out of control at this point. And there's a lot more I can do that will automate that feedback that I think will be as valuable as me sitting there and getting tired and more fatigued and trying to give fake feedback because I'm too tired. But I am going to preserve those capstone. So the memo and the notice of application, I'm definitely preserving those. And in my seminars, there's a lot more bespoke feedback. I hope that helps.
So I guess one suggestion would be to stagger the assignments so that a different subgroup of students are giving you work to read each week, so that in a class of 70, I never have more than 10 600-word short pieces to read in a week. That takes me an afternoon. So it's manageable. Whereas I think that one of the scary things for people who are used to 100% finals, which we haven't had at McGill for years and years, the university banned any 100% final evaluation a long time ago. So people have found all kinds of different ways to adjust and to have interim evaluations. But I think one of the biggest mistakes that people continue to make is having an interim evaluation for 70 or 100 students that are all due at the same time. And then they are just crushed, with trying to give individualized written feedback in the middle of a term. And that's bad at the best of times. When you add on all of the stuff that we are going to have on our shoulders for this fall, I think that could just tip the balance over, it'll just be crazy. So that's one way to do it, that the interim evaluation doesn't have to be the identical assignment for everybody. You can have them doing things at different times. And then I've tried to connect the expertise that they develop in writing something in their week to then being a group leader or a class leader in that week as well. I just want to add one thing about, I think Craig knows this from past discussions that we've had, but the language of flipped, of course, is predicated on an assumption that the classroom that you think is the normal classroom or the standard or the accepted usual classroom is one that indeed can be replaced by a recorded lecture that is and the imparting of information. So some of us have never flipped because we never thought that that was what a classroom was in the first place. So that the classroom and that's actually why I personally am finding the notion of recorded lectures a little bit of a mystery, because the teaching and learning that I try to engage in my active classroom is all interactive. It's all dynamic. There is no part where I'm reading from a text or delivering information that the students couldn't pull out of their reading. And so that has been a particular challenge, and I don't know how much this resonates with others in the forum, but and participants who are listening, but I think one of the things I have found difficult is this language of recorded lectures or voiceover PowerPoint. So some of us don't use PowerPoints. We don't have fixed materials that we present ever in our teaching. And so that has meant, that doesn't mean that I can't go remote, even in total resistance mode. But what I have found is that and what I did at the end of this last term with my big class was a real mix of very short podcast pieces, so 10 minutes, recorded conversations with another prof so that it wasn't just me talking, but instead having kind of a fireside chat via Zoom that was then recorded for 40 minutes that the students then watched as part of their class, that was followed up by breakout groups and conversation, question, answer. So there's still lots of possibilities for trying to capture some of that interactive dynamic virtually, and giving that kind of feedback on a constant level that many of us try to do in the classroom with small group work. So I will leave it there.
I think, Sonia, if you couldn't read my lips, I was saying, I think you have a comment.
So just very briefly, like, these are great questions and answers, and I find myself in a similar position than as Shauna, is that I've been trying really hard to make sure that my lectures aren't recordable, in part because of various kind of happenstance at Osgoode. I want my first year students to be at school, and I have to record even regularly. And so, but I want work to be done in my classroom. I want active work to be done in my classroom. So I'm also worried about the demand, the need to provide some asynchronicity or asynchronous possibilities. I am really worried about that, but I understand what the need is right now. But on the question of feedback, I've got 3 suggestions. The first one is to provide, make space, maybe even graded necessary space. So not graded, but like, let's say marked space for people to do a self-evaluation. You provide a ton of guidance around the self-evaluation. So they get graded for handing in the thing, then they get like a tick box or whatever for performing the self-evaluation, in which you go through a lot of things. And then you ask the student to say, you know, where did you fall down on this and why? And then after that, you say, having gone through that, do you still want to talk to me about it? And then you invite people to come and talk to you for individualized feedback. And you will get, I mean, even on exams, I have found like just way fewer people. The second thing is group work. I'm very worried about group work under these conditions, in part from watching what's happening with my kids when they get assigned group work right now in their online school. It is not going well. But normally I do have group work, and I have an assignment that I offer optionally as group work, so you can do it yourself or you can do it in a group. And I've been very happily surprised that in the more recent years, students overwhelmingly choose to do it in groups. Law students choosing group work is a thing, right, for me. So I was happy about that. That cuts grading. And then providing a lot of guidance about the point of group work is not to split the assignment into 4 equal parts and each do, but rather to work on it together. And then the last thing is the kind of rubrics where you can offer quick feedback because you know that there are 6 problems that you see 1,000 times. So how can you kind of very quickly use codes or something to signal those problems and spend your time on the things that are individually coming up for that particular student that you want to spend your time on. I am really interested in this question of feedback also from the perspective of grad program director. How do you talk to students about what feedback is and how to make use of it? Not to mention faculty development on feedback, which is like a whole nother story. But I think that a lot of it is need for feedback is often quite undifferentiated. Like students just want feedback. And I think thinking carefully about, well, what kind of feedback do people need? When do they need it? How do they need it? Is exceptionally important, but you also have to train students or teach them to recognize feedback when they see it. So that if you are doing something in the classroom and you're asking people to kind of iterate their problem solving kind of train of thought, and you're responding to that, that is feedback, right? That is learning. So this is like a bigger challenge, but I also am teaching a first-year class. It's mandatory. They don't have a choice. They will get me as their teacher, even if it was the last thing in the world that they ever wanted, even if they begged, please, please, not Lawrence, I don't want to listen to her for a whole semester. It will happen anyway. So I also feel like there are some concerns that Craig can set to the side because he can warn people, and I can't do that. And I feel pretty strongly about that in terms of large lecture, that I need to pay attention to the fact that they got scheduled into my class. It was no choice of theirs.
Thanks, Sonia, and everyone for responding. I've gone through the question list, and obviously a lot of people have departed, although we've still got a couple of Zoom windows worth of people tuned in. We agree that we'll sort of have a hard finish at 3:30, but Lachlan Cornt apparently hasn't heard enough about the lemons, and so has a question to pose. If I can throw to you, Lachlan.
Great, thank you very much. My question is, how will things never be the same again after COVID? What changes that we implemented during COVID look to be improvements on the prior status quo, and what will stay on in the post-COVID era?
I have a joke. Can I tell my joke?
Please. Sure.
Well, someone said to me, it's not even my joke, someone said to me, you know what's going to happen is that in 150 years, some poor law student is going to be like, why do we have to wear this piece of cloth that covers our mouth? And somebody will just yell at them, like, it's tradition. We have to respect it. So, I mean.
And the piece of cloth will cost $1,000.
But I think it's a good question. But from my perspective, since this is so far from being over, and that the middle period of this looks to be going on for some considerable period of time, I feel like it's a great question to pin up on the wall, but I can't start to formulate an answer right now.
I think I have an indication from BC and from Craig, at least.
Yeah. Craig, do you mind if I go now?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So I think that I don't pretend to have an answer to that question, but I think a lived reality, which is not really a problem of COVID-19, is one that we spoke about in the opening rounds, and it's one of the inequality, the race issues. The things that care for us as humans, and I think it's important, if only the way to, if it's only to remind ourselves that we will try our best, at least personally, not to keep this job as a transactional thing, making it relational, bringing a human face to it, while we do what we can individually. I think is already one thing we must remind ourselves of. Right? We can think about what it then means post-COVID-19, but there are lived realities that we're all dealing with right now. And it's not just about race. It's single parenting, challenged students. I taught a student last week who had 3 jobs. 3 jobs. Trying to get into law school, it's tough, right? So I think those are things we can start thinking about as law professors, about what it means for the job we're doing and why we're doing it. Thanks.
So Lachlan, you've asked a really big question, sort of Oracle of Delphi style question here. I guess I'm less preoccupied with the COVID than the fallout from COVID. So this was something Sonia talked about as well. I don't know what post-secondary looks like in a year, right? I don't know if the minister says, why are we teaching 101 courses in 52 institutions? Why don't we just get the best lecturer and pre-record it and everyone else is a TA? So we are not masters of our own destiny here. And so that makes it really, really difficult to answer the question. I do know though, and this also echoes what Shauna was saying, if we're gonna have a response to someone who says, why don't we do that? We better have a pretty good argument in favor of in-person education that's more than, well, it's tradition, or we have this nostalgia, or it's kind of this amorphous thing that happens that we can't really describe in the classroom. In other words, we better be thinking about the pedagogical argument. And I'm not sure how sympathetic our respective provincial governments are going to be, but at least we'll have something to say. Because I'm not sure right now that we would have much to say other than an appeal to tradition. So that's what worries me a whole lot. And it's the great unknown. And it's a great unknown in many sectors, obviously, because of the economic fallout. We've never seen this in our lifetimes.
Thanks, Craig. And Shauna, to add on.
Thanks. So I'm going to take this as a chance to go to one of my favorite quotes from Benjamin Cardozo, which is, "One must be historian and prophet all at once." And he was talking specifically about jurists. So to answer, look, we can't, I mean, as my co-panelists have said, we none of us have a clear, concrete answer, but what we can do and we have to do is keep asking the kinds of questions that we've been asking, and thinking through and sharing and articulating clearly what we value in the choice we've made in our careers to be in higher education. But the history, I think about how in kind of medieval times there were basically 3 things you could study in university: medicine for the human body, theology for the human soul, and law for human communities. And so it's not surprising to me that a whole lot of what we keep grasping at and talking about is the significance of community when we are all in legal education. And I think then it's incumbent on us again to be a little bit more precise and to push us to think about how law and legal tradition and legal reasoning and methodology is all about responding to uncertainty, so that that law itself substantively and legal education really rely on human communities and capacities. And so the kinds of paying attention to how hard it is for a lot of people to take on the studying of law along the lines that BC was talking about, and then being more sharply aware of that, and how even with all of those difficulties, I think most of our students prefer to come to campus to be together, even when it's really hard. And that might give us some beginning kind of foundation to build on in articulating what we want to try to hold on to in light of what and here I agree with Craig, what is coming down the road are going to be big monetary questions about financial investment in education.
Thanks,
Shauna. Sonia had something to add.
Yeah, I'm just going to add something from the Osgoode perspective here, which is, as you know, we've had many strikes at Osgoode, and I think this is something I can predict for all of you now, is that once we recorded in order to facilitate, recorded classes in order to facilitate students not crossing, who would not cross picket lines, we are still struggling to figure out what to do about constant demands for recording of everything and access to everyone for those recordings. So my guess would be one of the things that's going to stick around and that you might want to think about is how will you, just as Craig talked about managing expectations, if this is over and we can return, how will you deal with not legit requests for safety, other kinds of reasons, but just the expectation that one does not actually need to be in the same city, or take the time to come up to campus. I think that's probably something that will stick around for a while and that we will have to deal with.
And just a hot pursuit here, we're seeing that right now at the University of Ottawa. There's just an expectation, an assumption by our students that everything will be recorded and they can do it on their own time. To which the response is, no, I still want to have some synchronous education where we're collectively having a conversation. Oh, well, you can record that. Well, yeah, but attendance is mandatory. Okay, well, what if I can't make it? Well, then there's an equity issue there. Go to the equity counselor. And by the way, if I'm recording it, what do I do with all the students who now you can peer into their bedrooms because you're on Zoom? And what about the privacy issues? Like, none of this has been internalized by students, but the demands are starting to come.
Thanks, Craig and everyone. And just on that point, Alison Ballard, I think from Australia, was here at one point and had this sort of question, which we won't get to, but it reinforces the point. She wrote, "It does worry me that the pandemic will be used as an opportunity to speed up the closure of physical campuses and move everything online, certainly in Australia, which essentially equates to the real devaluing of higher education more broadly. I'd be interested in ideas on how to combat these sorts of issues in light of what Shauna said about all the positive literature around the value benefits of online education, which could be misused to undermine the academy going forward." So that's just to sort of reinforce the concern. I think looking at the time, lucky last, Dia has a question about the graduate studies arena. So Dia.
I'll keep it brief. Thank you so much for the last few hours. It's been lovely seeing lots of you, at least by Zoom. Much of the discussion has been on basically bachelor's and first year classes, and that's fine. That's a lot of what's concerning us. But I'm also thinking about how do we maintain some form of community, especially for students starting graduate studies or who are in the middle of their graduate studies and who may be losing interest in said project moving forward, and especially international students who I think are particularly vulnerable to some of these issues. We're starting to have these discussions, but I would love to have some feedback from other institutions on this. Thanks.
So I have Craig and I have Sonia.
Sonia, why don't you go first? Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, Dia, I'm happy to talk about this anytime, and I think as I said, from across Canada, we've been talking about this quite a bit. It's a huge worry, and at this point in time, especially for international students, there's also a whole range of particular vulnerabilities and uncertainties for them to deal with. And I've found that particularly challenging. Right now, one of the things I'm trying to think about is how do faculty members build spaces or create scaffolds for students that students can use to create community that they want, right? Rather than somehow me creating more obligations in their week that they're just coming out to things to, like, as Sonia said, that she's going to do like this coffee room or whatever. So at 3 o'clock today, our students have a weekly coffee room. Not that many people come to it, but I think for the people who do, it's quite helpful. And they are talking about how can they use that more social space to share work. We're also doing virtual shut up and write sessions, which frankly are the only way I'm getting any writing done at all. So, you know, those work well as well. And I think one of the things I'm doing as the program director is that trying to monitor who is not showing up for any of these, and then maybe I can reach out to those people. Because I think, you know, it's kind of a joke in graduate education, you know, graduate education is practice for isolation, right? And so that thinking about how to, but isolation is also an enormous problem for graduate students in the best of times. And actually, if I can just tie this back to some of the other discussions, to be honest, I think that the main thing that we're likely to see is that distance leads to non-completion. And that is the thing that we are going to end up saying, well, this is important, right? You want people to be going to school and not finishing. The experience of the strikes at Osgoode, it's absolutely obvious that in the graduate program, in the years when not all of the graduate students are on strike, because not all of them are union members, like the LLMs, for instance, are not union members, they're not crossing, but the completion rates in those years are not great. And I'm not making a statistical claim here, but I'm just telling you from anecdotal experience that it's about completion and kind of how do you maintain that community, even if that community isn't particularly openly supportive or not constructed in that way. So I'm hoping for more opportunities for students to be able to present their work in progress, super low stakes. We're doing a lot of practice job talks for our students and then inviting all the other students. So students who have a very credible shot at a job interview or in fact have one scheduled, do those. We're trying to do things of that nature so that they're like low stakes, not too stressful for the most of the students. I'm also going to run something for the incoming students in June instead of in September when I usually do, on working with a supervisor, and try to think and try to do some faculty development too around what is supervision remotely. Not that I have any idea, but what is, like, try to generate some discussion around what might we do to support students in this situation. We have like limited numbers of international students, and all of them are directly supervised. Like it's a 100% kind of supervision model. So ideally, this will not be too hard in this particular program. But I think I think it's a fantastic question, and I'm not sure about the answer, because if anything, amazingly, I think the graduate students are in even more financial. The financial thing has taken up almost all of the initial time, trying to find ways to support, in particular, the international students who are in very dire circumstances, and then, you know, huge numbers of domestic students who are as well. And I do not want to run, and I do not think Osgoode should ever run a remote PhD program. No. Some other school can experiment with that. I'm sure it will be a fantastic innovation, but no. Yeah, so for what it's worth.
Right.
Yeah, so very quickly, because I see the time. So Sonia has some really great ideas about community, and I think she's way ahead of us. We've got a really big program, so any given year we probably have somewhere between 90 and 100 graduate students entering our program, many of whom are international, very few of whom we expect to turn up in September for obvious reasons. But we want to maintain at least some link with them, which is what's motivating us to move towards an asynchronous micro-credential, so that our university calls it stickability. I don't know how that translates into French, actually, but presumably that's a French version of that. The idea is to retain at least the interest of some students who might then segue into coming on campus in person. The challenge, though, are the ones that Sonia raised, and that is the creating the sense of community. And so how do you do that? Well, I mean, we've been talking about many of the initiatives that Sonia's been talking about, and some of that's been going on, but there's only one faculty member for all these programs, right? I mean, it's not like we have a JD cohort and we've got a graduate cohort, and no one gets any workload credit for graduate supervision. So it's usually sort of side of the desk and not sort of what they see themselves as principally being about. And everyone's running around doing their emergency research projects that seem to be all about COVID-19 and their implications for area X of my research speciality, right? So I'm not seeing a lot of pivot on the part of colleagues from research intensity to sort of all people pulling oars, and we're going to create a new community. And in the absence of that sort of recommitment of time, it's just not sustainable to ask the same handful of faculty members to constantly step to the plate. And so that's just the stuff Sonia's describing is probably the sort of stuff that I fear is going to fall to the cutting room floor. Now, I mean, the other issue for grad students is, and this goes back to our doom and gloom about the future of post-secondary, is the research-intensive university going to survive? I don't know. I'm tempted to say no. And Sonia, no more strikes at Osgoode because the Ontario government will just issue an emergency order under the Emergency Act, and that's it. You're all working. So.
All right. Well, on that note of the end of the university, thanks. No, thanks for those observations too. So we've run out of time. I'm going to throw back to Derek to finally close us down. But before I do that, I'm sure everyone wants to join with me in thanking Derek for pulling this together and managing the sign-ons and everything, and moderating the panel. Thanks so much, Derek, for your leadership on this.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone else. I've really enjoyed the conversation this afternoon. I really appreciate all of you who stuck it out to the bitter end. There are a lot of things to think about. I will not attempt, given the time, I will not attempt to try to synthesize or sum up any of the things. Just I hope that we can continue these conversations in other fora, whether in person, or whether online or in person someday, hopefully, and we'll see where we can take it from here. Good luck, everyone. Stay well, hang in there, and see you soon.
At the AGM tomorrow.
At the AGM. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Bye.